This morning, a state of emergency across California as massive amounts of rain drench the West. It is day 3 of a relentless storm that has now turned deadly.
In California, dangerous waves are creating havoc along the Pacific coast to end the year. Powerful storms are churning up ocean water.
Oh my God, look at that. It's going all the way up.
400 meters of coastline disappeared in a single night. Not eroded over years, not cracked by an earthquake, just gone. Residents woke up to emergency alerts and the distant sound of what some described as thunder rolling across the ocean. But when daylight came, the reality was worse than anyone imagined. Entire sections of bluff had collapsed into the Pacific, taking fences, roads, and backyards with them. Property lines that had existed for decades now ended in open air. The land hadn't slowly retreated, it had failed all at once. What made it even more terrifying was what didn't happen. There was no shaking strong enough to send people running outside, no massive waves surging inland, no obvious warning sign that disaster was seconds away. The ground simply gave out beneath itself, as if something deep below had finally snapped. Officials rushed to secure the area, but confusion spread quickly. How could hundreds of meters of coastline vanish without a classic trigger? And by the next morning, scientists were staring at the data in disbelief, because the collapse hadn't behaved like any disaster they'd seen before. But what they discovered next would change the entire. At first, the assumption seemed obvious. A powerful storm had just battered the coast, waves were high, rainfall had been relentless, so the collapse must have been storm damage. But when seismologists pulled the overnight readings, the evidence didn't match that explanation at all. There was no classic earthquake signature, no sharp seismic spike, no sudden rupture tearing through rock. Instead, instruments showed something far stranger. Hours of deep, low-frequency vibrations coming from beneath the surface. Signals so subtle that most people would never notice them, and in many cases, monitoring systems barely flagged them as dangerous. The ground had moved, but not in the violent way everyone expects. It had slipped. Scientists call this aseismic movement, when faults grind slowly past each other without producing noticeable shaking. Normally, this kind of motion actually releases pressure and reduces risk, but here, it appeared to be doing the opposite. The land above had been weakening silently, almost like a structure being loosened bolt by bolt over time. And that realization shifted the entire investigation, because if the collapse wasn't caused by a sudden event, it meant the process had already been unfolding long before anyone realized something was wrong. And what researchers uncovered next suggested the coastline had been moving for months. That's when scientists turned to satellite data, and what they saw changed everything. Using ground deformation radar collected by NASA and field measurements from the United States Geological Survey, researchers began mapping how the land had been behaving in the months leading up to the collapse. The results were unsettling. Entire stretches of coastline had been slowly sagging toward the ocean, millimeter by millimeter, like a conveyor belt moving too slowly for the human eye to detect. Homes, roads, and cliffs that looked perfectly stable were actually drifting forward over time. No cracks, no obvious warning signs, just gradual deformation accumulating beneath the surface. When scientists overlaid these movement patterns with underground fault maps, a hidden pattern emerged. The motion wasn't centered on the major, well-known faults people usually worry about. Instead, it traced along smaller, lesser-known fractures buried beneath coastal bluffs, geological weak points that had received far less attention over the years. The land wasn't just being pushed by waves from the outside, it was being pulled from below. And the longer this silent movement continued, the more stress built inside the ground structure above it. Layers of soil and sediment were bending, stretching, and weakening without anyone realizing how close they were to failure. But slow movement alone doesn't erase hundreds of meters of coastline overnight. Something else had to be happening underground, something that turned gradual motion into sudden collapse. And when investigators looked deeper beneath the surface, when investigators finally examined what lay beneath the collapsed coastline, the discovery was even more alarming than the movement itself. Deep soil samples revealed that the ground under that stretch of bluff wasn't solid rock, the way many people imagine coastal cliffs to be. Instead, it was made up of layered sediment, loose sand sitting above pockets of clay, with fractures running through it like tiny veins. Under normal conditions, those layers can remain stable for decades, but when pressure, water, and movement combine, the entire structure starts behaving less like stone and more like a sponge. Weeks of intense rain had already saturated the soil from above. Ocean spray spray and storm surges added moisture from the sides. Meanwhile, groundwater levels were rising from below. As the hidden fault movement slowly distorted the layers, small voids began forming underground, empty spaces where sediment shifted or washed away. Picture a honeycomb. At first, it holds together, but as moisture seeps in and pressure builds, the walls weaken. Eventually, the structure can't support its own weight anymore. That's exactly what scientists believe happened here. By the time the collapse occurred, the land above had essentially been sitting on a fragile network of hollowed pockets. The final trigger, whether it was wave impact, gravitational stress, or one last subtle slip underground, didn't need to be dramatic. The foundation was already gone. So when witnesses heard that thunder-like roar in the night, it wasn't the ocean destroying the coast, it was the ground collapsing into itself. And what caused that final tipping point would reveal an even bigger danger. The deeper scientists looked, the clearer it became that this disaster wasn't caused by one single force. It was a collision of multiple threats happening at the same time. First, there was a silent tectonic movement beneath the surface, the slow fault slip that had been weakening the ground for months. Then came the record rainfall, which pushed groundwater levels higher than normal, saturating already fragile soil layers. On top of that, powerful winter waves battered the base of the cliffs, removing what little structural support remained. Each factor alone might not have caused a catastrophe. Together, they created the perfect conditions for sudden failure. Researchers call this a compound hazard, when different natural processes interact and amplify each other in ways that traditional risk models don't fully capture. Most hazard maps are built around isolated threats, earthquake zones, flood zones, erosion zones, but this event didn't fit neatly into any one category. It crossed all of them, and that's why it wasn't predicted. The land had been quietly weakening underground, the water had been steadily infiltrating from above and below, and the ocean had been applying constant pressure from the outside. By the time those forces aligned, the collapse wasn't gradual, it was instantaneous, like a rug being pulled out from under everything at once. That realization is what's alarming officials the most, because if multiple conditions have to line up to trigger a disaster like this, then it means other stretches of coastline could already be approaching the same tipping point without anyone realizing it. And the next discovery raised an even more uncomfortable question. How many hidden fault zones? What truly unsettled experts wasn't just the collapse itself, it was where the movement had originated. The deformation patterns didn't align with the major fault systems everyone knows about, like the infamous San Andreas fault. Instead, they traced along smaller, lesser-known fractures buried beneath coastal communities. These minor faults rarely produce large earthquakes, which is exactly why they've historically received less attention in hazard plans. But less dramatic doesn't mean harmless. Over decades, cities expanded across bluffs and shorelines, assuming that the biggest danger came from shake, not silent ground deformation. Neighborhoods, highways, schools, and utilities were built over geological seams that, while quiet, were still active. And now, new data suggests those seams may be capable of triggering structural land failures without any classic warning signs. In other words, the threat wasn't hidden because it was unknown. It was hidden because it was underestimated. Geologists are now realizing that these smaller fault networks connect like weak stitches in fabric. As tectonic stress builds and releases through slow movement, the ground above gradually loses integrity. Add water saturation and coastal erosion into the equation, and entire sections of land can reach a breaking point without ever producing a noticeable earthquake. That possibility changes the risk map dramatically, because if one overlooked fault zone caused this level of destruction, there could be many more city beneath populated areas right now, quietly shifting beneath homes and infrastructure. And that raises a question officials are struggling to answer. If the ground itself can't be trusted, how do you decide where it's safe to live?
In the days after the collapse, the conversation along the coast shifted from shock to something more complicated: uncertainty. Engineers moved quickly to inspect nearby bluffs, installing monitoring equipment and scanning for fresh cracks. Emergency crews blocked off unstable ledges, but behind the visible response was a much larger realization taking shape. Recovery might not be the main challenge, adaptation might be. Because if the coastline can fail without warning, rebuilding in the same place suddenly becomes a gamble. Insurance companies began reassessing risk models almost immediately, and some property owners found themselves facing a harsh possibility. Coverage might disappear long before the danger does. Local officials started reviewing zoning laws, development permits, and evacuation plans, trying to answer a question no one had seriously confronted before: what if retreat is safer than rebuilding? For decades, coastal living was associated with stability and value. Oceanfront property meant permanence, but this event shattered that assumption. Communities now had to consider the idea that some land might simply not be reliable anymore, not because of erosion over generations, but because of sudden structural failure that could happen within minutes. Urban planners are calling this a new phase ways of coastal management. Instead of fighting nature indefinitely with seawalls and reinforcements, some areas may need to move infrastructure inland over time. Roads could be rerouted, utilities relocated, entire neighborhoods gradually shifted away from vulnerable zones. It's a concept that feels extreme until you realize the alternative is living above ground that may already be weakening. And the most unsettling part is that this dilemma isn't limited to one stretch of shoreline, because what's happening here could be a preview of challenges facing coastlines far beyond this region. What makes this event so important isn't just the land that was lost, it's what it reveals about the future. Coastlines around the world are under pressure from multiple directions at once. Rising seas increase groundwater levels, stronger storms deliver heavier rainfall, wave energy intensifies, and in tectonically active regions, even slow underground movement can quietly weaken the land from below. When those forces combine, the result isn't always gradual erosion. Sometimes it's sudden disappearance. What happened along the shores of California may be one of the clearest examples yet of how compound risks are reshaping natural hazards. The old idea of planning for one threat at a time, an earthquake, a flood, or coastal erosion, is becoming outdated. The reality now is overlap, interaction, chain reactions that don't follow predictable timelines. And that changes how communities everywhere have to think about safety. Scientists emphasize that this isn't about panic, it's about awareness. Monitoring technology is improving. Satellite measurements are becoming more precise. Early detection systems are expanding. But information alone doesn't eliminate risk. It only gives people the chance to act before a tipping point arrives. Because the most important lesson from this collapse is also the simplest. The ground beneath us is never truly still. It shifts slowly, silently, constantly, until one moment when the balance breaks. And when that moment comes, the difference between disaster and survival may depend on whether we recognize the warning signs or assumed the land would always stay where it was. The coastline didn't just change overnight. Our understanding of stability did too. And the question now isn't whether landscapes will keep transforming, it's whether we'll adapt fast enough to keep up.